This is another video I've wanted to do for quite a while. It's been a pretty busy summer and even into the fall. I haven't had a lot of time to get to this video, but now's the opportunity for me to do that. And I wanted to do a quick summary of a solar installation we did at the house here earlier this year. So this is the PV array that we installed in the yard. It's rated at 10 kilowatts. It's basically composed of 40 250 watt panels. And unlike a conventional array that you might see that uses microinverters, we have chosen to use a string inverter arrangement for this setup. And that gives us a little bit of flexibility. And one of the key pieces that we were really trying to capture was having battery storage and not just selling to the utility. Unfortunately, the utility in our area really gives you a terrible deal on energy that you're selling back to them. It's at a fraction of what you would be purchasing energy for. And so that's why we really elected to go with the battery storage. It does give other flexibility as well, so that we have not only battery storage for our usage, but the hybrid inverter gives some uninterruptible power supply functionality so that we could ride out a power outage without any significant discomfort to our daily lives. So this is the back of the ground mounted array. We chose to go with a ground mounted array rather than a roof mounted array because it just makes the installation a little bit simpler. Having to put this square footage of panel onto a house roof would be quite a challenge, and there's always the risk of roof leaks, also the potential of fire damage if there was any kind of electrical faults. So keeping it off of the house was definitely a preferred approach here. The array is basically 8 panels long. It's 5 panels tall. It's mounted on helical ground anchors. Those anchors are drilled 8 feet into the ground, and the entire array is sited on 12 of those, so it is really well anchored. On those helical piles, it's just a tubular steel setup. It was designed by myself. I did have a structural engineer review the drawings and seal them. So this is an engineer certified structure, which is what our municipality requires for building permit applications. Now, I mentioned before that we are using a string inverter, not a microinverter arrangement here. And so what we do is we take out of the 8 panels wide by 5 panels tall, we take groups of 5 panels and 5 panels. We wire these in series. And so we have 4 groups of series panels. And then to send that back to the house, we take those sets of 4 and we put them into parallel. So these 2 sets of series strings are put in parallel, and these 2 sets of series strings are put in parallel. So that's all done over here at the combiner box. This is the PV system DC disconnect located on the side of the array out in the yard here. This cabinet serves several functions. As I mentioned, it is the DC disconnect. This is the main DC disconnect for the entire system. There are also 4 DC rated double pole breakers. Each of these breakers is allocated to one of the substrings in the array. And from there, we are combining 2 substrings in parallel, 2 substrings in parallel, so that we have basically 2 sets of PV inputs to the string inverter. These last 2 breakers over here, we're not going to get into those right now, but basically it's an experimental system. I'm trying to optimize the PV production, and so we'll get into that a little bit later, but right now we'll take a look at the other side of these wires over by the house. As you can see here, just as a little side note, we ended up trenching in about 165 feet of 1.5-inch conduit up to the side of the house. You can see here the trenching actually recovered really nicely over the summer, and the reason for that is before we went and cut the trench for the cable, we used a sod cutter, and basically we were able to flip the fresh sod over to the side, and so when we were trenching, we weren't actually destroying any of that turf. Once we got the conduit in and the trench backfilled, it was really just a matter of flipping that sod back over and watering it enough so that it could get reestablished. But it made for the remediation of that whole process really simple. And like I said, it's almost invisible. All of that trenching that we'd done, it really just disappears. You do see a little hint of it there, but took a lot less effort to get it restored than if we just cut straight through the turf. All right, so coming up to the side of the garage here, we have our system disconnects. These are all safety disconnects. The intention here is to have a readily accessible disconnect for any kind of first responders, firefighters, etc., to shut the system down without having to enter the premises. So starting from the left here, we have the AC disconnect for the uninterrupted power supply. I'll get into the detail about that a little bit later. Next, we have the AC disconnect for the PV inverter, and then this big cabinet here is another PV system DC disconnect. The difference between this disconnect and the one out in the array is this has a readily accessible disconnect knob, if you will, so that you don't have to open a cabinet. You can just simply turn that and isolate the DC from the inverter. This cabinet is also equipped with TVS, so transient voltage protection, and basically you want to have any kind of voltage protection or over voltage protection at the final point right before any of your PV wiring enters the premises. So this is where that's all located as well. So on the other side of this wall is where the inverter is located on the inside of the garage. All right, so here we are in the garage. This is the other side of the wall. Behind these devices is where the emergency disconnects are located outside. So we have our two primary components for this system. This is a Growatt SPH 6000. It is called a residential storage inverter. And over here we have a 48 volt nominal DC battery. It has a storage capacity of 14 kilowatt hours, and between these two, this is what really makes the whole PV system work. So without getting into great detail, the Growatt residential storage inverter serves multiple functions within this system. It accepts DC inputs from the PV array in the yard, and it's able to direct that energy to multiple locations. One of which is to charge the storage battery. It is also able to, through a grid interactive inverter, basically cancel out household usage without exporting additional energy to the grid. That is achieved by a set of CTs and a remote RS-485 meter that communicates with the inverter. Basically, it is measuring how much energy the household is consuming, and it ramps the inverter output up or down to cancel that out. Another really cool feature of this inverter is that it has an uninterrupted power supply function. So when the utility power isn't available, this inverter has basically a separate off-grid inverter, and so that can power an additional kind of critical load panel within the household. The battery is a pretty simple unit. It has an on-off button, LCD display with some buttons to navigate through the menus and configure the BMS. At the bottom are our DC outputs, and there is some communication ports located under there, and that allows the battery and the inverter to communicate, basically relaying state of charge information, what capacity is remaining. If there is any kind of alarms that are coming up on the battery, it will relay those to the inverter, and then it will report that back through the Growatt app. So you're probably wondering why I would choose to go with a string inverter and battery storage as opposed to a grid tie inverter and just sell excess energy back to the utility. Well, it's a pretty easy answer where we live. Our local utility sells energy for 10 cents per kilowatt hour. They purchase energy from local generation based on a wholesale rate. That wholesale rate historically has ranged from as high as 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour to 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Being able to store that energy locally rather than selling it to the utility allows us to use that energy later. Additionally, it allows us to have UPS functionality, so in the case of a power outage, our system can operate independently from the grid and carry us through any kind of blackouts. Part I haven't really touched on yet is this last box located between the inverter and the battery. This is just a DC breaker to isolate the battery from the inverter. And so that's a quick review of our PV installation that we did this year. You might be wondering, well, how's it been performing this year so far? Well, we completed the installation in the middle of July, being the middle of October now. We've so far generated 4,100 kilowatt hours of energy. That's 4.1 megawatt hours. We've also been able to store 1,600 kilowatt hours of energy into the battery. And so the battery is well on its way to paying for itself just by providing local storage and consumption ability. And really, that's all I have to go over in this video. I would like to make a couple other short videos to look at the battery, inverter, and even the construction of the array in a little bit more detail. But for now, thanks for watching.